They say Florence is built on art, marble, and genius, but I know better. Florence was built on fear, blood, and the weight of golden florins, ours. The Medici name is carved into this city like veins in a marble statue. And no poets may romanticize our grandeur. I was there. I watched how we clawed upward from merchants to monarchs without ever wearing a crown. I saw the blade behind the brushstroke, the poison behind the praise. Before I became Lorenzo the Magnificent, before the artists kissed my ring and the Vatican trembled at my name, we were just clever bankers. Men like my great-grandfather Giovanni, calm, calculating, a man who understood one terrifying truth: power doesn't come from titles, it comes from control. While noble families played with swords and armies, we played with loans, influence, and secrets. Giovanni de' Medici. That's the man who truly forged our path. When others bowed before the corrupt papacy, he offered them coin and silence. When noblemen fought petty wars, he financed both sides. Every gold coin he lent came back to us with strings attached, tighter than any iron chain. It wasn't long before his cunning birthed the Medici Bank, a sprawling, whisper-fed empire across Florence, Rome, Venice, even London. We were everywhere and yet nowhere. No one could name our armies, but every prince owed us something. Every bishop whispered our name during confessions. We were the men behind the curtain before anyone even knew there was a curtain. But power, I learned, has its price. When my grandfather Cosimo de' Medici rose to dominate Florence's politics, he wasn't given a throne. He built it himself, not from wood, but from fear and favor. He was exiled once, humiliated by jealous nobles, but Cosimo played the long game. He returned stronger, his enemies scattered like rats, and in their place, our loyalists. People we fed, funded, and promised a piece of the city in exchange for obedience. Yet it wasn't until I, Lorenzo, inherited the weight of our dynasty that I understood how deep the treachery went. My own cousin Giuliano and I grew up among snakes, smiles that hid daggers, artists who sketched betrayal in charcoal before breakfast, and clergy who prayed with one hand while poisoning wine with the other. Florence in the 1400s was a chessboard, and the Medici family, they were the rival kings itching to strike. I watched them, proud, envious, blood-hungry. They smiled in the public square and plotted in candle-lit rooms behind basilicas. They hated that a family of bankers ruled their world, that we, the Medici, commanded more respect than any blue-blooded duke. So they planned our death. They called it the Medici conspiracy. They meant to slaughter Giuliano and me during Easter Mass, in the sacred Santa Maria del Fiore, in front of God, our people, and the stained glass saints. It was theatrical, cruel, fitting. Giuliano was stabbed to death. I still see the blood pooling at the altar. But I survived. My escape wasn't noble. It was desperate, clawing, blooded. I bear the scars even now, as I whisper this into history's ear. After that day, I changed. Florence changed. The facade of peace we upheld was shattered. And so I did what every Medici before me would have done. I turned betrayal into an empire. We crushed the Medici, publicly, brutally. We hanged their co-conspirators from the windows of the Palazzo della Signoria, where birds pecked at their corpses as a warning. The message was clear: betray the Medici, and your family name will rot from every stone wall. But revenge was never the goal, control was. When my brother Giuliano died on the altar floor, blood seeping into holy marble, I realized something: the church is not sacred. It is vulnerable, and vulnerability, in Florence, is a currency. My enemies had chosen the church as the stage for our murder to humiliate us. But I would make the church our puppet instead. You see, long before the Medici's blades found Giuliano, we had begun buying influence in Rome, not with prayers, but with gold. Giovanni, Cosimo, even we understood something every true Medici did. The Pope was not God's voice. He was a man, and every man has a price. In Rome, Holiness was an auction. We bankrolled popes, funded crusades, covered the Vatican's debt in return for favors, written in invisible ink. We did not seek spiritual salvation, we sought strategic dominion. And when we wanted something, we didn't ask. We placed someone inside the throne. That someone was my son, Giovanni di Lorenzo de' Medici. A child born to wear velvet gloves over iron fists. At 7, I had him studying canon law. At 11, he was a cardinal. Not a whisper of resistance from Rome. Why? Because the Medici owned the bankers who owned the Pope. It wasn't about faith. It was about leverage. While Giovanni learned Latin hymns and doctrine, I taught him a different scripture, betrayal. I told him never to trust smiles. That even bishops carried blades. That alliances lasted only as long as the last bribe. And I was right. When Pope Sixtus IV turned his back on Florence, endorsing the Pazzi and excommunicating our city, I responded not with swords, but with diplomacy dipped in venom. I rode to Naples, alone, risked my life to negotiate peace. The world called it bravery. I called it calculated survival. Because while the church condemned Florence, I planted seeds. I whispered in ears. I bought allegiances like apples in the market. Within years, the church that had exiled me was now crawling with Medici loyalists. And then, the grandest triumph. Giovanni became Pope Leo X. The boy I had groomed now sat on St. Peter's throne. They say God chooses the Pope. That's a lie. We did, as Pope. Giovanni was no saint. He spent like a king, feasted like a sultan, and ruled like a Medici. Ruthlessly polite, charmingly corrupt, he sold indulgences, sanctioned wars, and drained the Vatican coffers. All while praising God. And every coin flowed through Medici fingers. But our enemies did not vanish. No, they grew more dangerous. Because now, they hid behind cassocks and incense. The Sforzes, the Borgias, the Del Laro Vera. Families who whispered scripture by day and plotted murder by moonlight. Rome was not a city of peace. It was a cesspool of poisoned goblets and veiled threats. And in the midst of it all, we stood, not as holy men, but as architects of influence. We were the Medici, sinners disguised as saviors. Betrayal was our doctrine, power our communion. They call me Lorenzo the Magnificent, but they rarely ask why. They think it's about poetry, or palaces, or Botticelli's brush. It's not. It's because I learned how to use art, not to heal Florence, but to arm it. After the murder of my brother Giuliano, the city expected war, but I gave them something more seductive than vengeance. I gave them beauty, and through that beauty, I bought obedience. When I walked the scorched streets of Florence after the Pazzi conspiracy, I didn't see a grieving city. I saw a theatre, and I was both director and audience. Statues rose from plazas like marble ghosts. Murals turned walls into myths. Every chapel, every fresco, every choir was not just decoration. It was a message, a warning, a propaganda machine. You see, art is not passive. It teaches, it controls. And the Medici knew how to commission artists, not just to glorify God, but to immortalize us. I paid Michelangelo's rent when he was still a boy chiseling discarded stones. I gave Botticelli the freedom to paint his birth of Venus, not out of piety, but because myth-making is power. Venus wasn't just a goddess. She was Florence reborn. Our city, my city. Every canvas we commissioned served a double purpose, paint on one side, politics on the other. The people didn't realize it, but we were etching our bloodline into the very air they breathed. But don't mistake elegance for mercy. Behind the velvet curtains of our salons were whispers of poison and plots. For every sculpture we raised, a rival was buried. We killed with charm, smiled while stabbing. And when art failed to control our enemies, we turned to silence. I remember one night, a poet named Niccolò made jest of our family during a gathering. Harmless laughter, he thought, but by morning, his funding had disappeared, his patrons gone. Within weeks, He was begging in the same streets where he once dined with dukes. That was the Medici touch. We didn't always use blades. We erased you with elegance, but sometimes, blood had to answer blood. The Pazzi weren't the last to try. There were always more, monks, merchants, even cousins, who thought Florence could be taken. But Florence was mine. I kept it alive by feeding it carefully measured portions of fear and wonder. Art was my weapon, architecture my battlefield. Churches, libraries, academies, all tools of control, all built with a purpose. I wasn't building a city, I was building a myth, one where every dome echoed Medici might, where even God's shadow looked like ours. And when my enemies looked up to admire the Sistine ceilings, or the Duomo's perfect curve, they forgot they were prisoners of design. That's the real legacy of the Renaissance. It wasn't a rebirth of culture. It was the refinement of control, and I, Lorenzo de Medici, made it beautiful. They called me the father of the fatherland, but I preferred the title I earned in whispers. Il Vecchio, the old one, not because I was frail, but because I understood what truly endures. Not swords, not crowns, not prayers, but ledgers, numbers, debt. The Medici didn't rise through noble blood. We rose through credit. We didn't inherit thrones, we sold them. When I was a young man, I sat in the dusty corner of my father Giovanni's counting room and watched him turn florins into futures. He knew what the princes didn't, that warlords may rule by fear, but they serve those who bankroll their wars. So we built a bank, not just a building, a mechanism. A machine that pumped power through Europe like a second heart. Our clients weren't peasants, they were popes. Yes, the church, that supposed bastion of humility, owed its existence to Medici interest rates. We didn't preach sermons, we sent invoices. When Pope John the 23rd needed to buy his way into the Vatican, who did he call? US. And when the papacy itself became our client, we became untouchable. Others opened markets, we opened offices, in Venice, Bruges, Avignon, London. Every branch was a tentacle, reaching into king's purses. Our clerks weren't just moneylenders. They were spies, economists, psychologists. If you wanted to understand the kingdom's future, you didn't visit its palace, you checked our books. Florence prospered, yes, but it obeyed. I never held a crown, yet dukes consulted me before spending a coin. When rival families plotted against us, I didn't raise an army. I pulled a few strings, delayed a loan here, called in a debt there. One duchy crumbled. Another prince begged forgiveness, all without drawing blood. My enemies tried to paint me as a tyrant cloaked in silk. Let them. I was no tyrant. I was the courtesy of Florence. You think Renaissance humanism blossomed on its own? No, we funded it. You think artists, architects, and scientists flourished by divine favor? No, we subsidized genius, because I knew a painting can inspire, a sculpture can command reverence, but a bank builds empires. My greatest weapon wasn't a sword, it was the Medici ledger. Inside it, names were crossed off or elevated, futures bought or buried. A single missed interest payment could shift borders. Even the nobility learned to whisper the word Medici with respect, not out of love, but out of need. It wasn't just money, it was trust. We moved funds across kingdoms at lightning speed. We created systems of letters of credit that kings relied on more than their own treasuries. Every gold coin passed through our hands like judgment from Olympus. And those we deemed unworthy, we erased financially, politically, and even historically. You see, history praises the warrior, but the warrior always kneels to the one who pays the army. I was Cosimo de Medici, not a king, not a pope, not a warrior, but the first built a dynasty from nothing but numbers. And when I died, Florence didn't just mourn, it trembled, because the true ruler of the city wasn't gone. His bloodline remained, and his ledger was still open. They crowned me in the grand halls of the Vatican, but the truth is, I was born crowned. Not with a halo, but with a name, Medici. When I became Pope Leo X in 1513, I wasn't just Giovanni anymore. I was the embodiment of a new god, one who wore silk, feasted nightly, and commissioned miracles with gold leaf and marble. I wasn't a monk, I was a prince in cassock, and Rome would learn the difference. The cardinals thought they were choosing a puppet. Instead, they got a lion draped in holy robes. I made it clear from my first mass, the Vatican was no longer just a spiritual empire. It was a Medici enterprise. My father, Lorenzo the Magnificent, had taught me early. Faith was a currency, like silver, and in Rome, the exchange rate was excellent. The Medici had always danced with power, but now we sat atop it. From Florence's counting houses to St. Peter's throne, our fingers gripped the levers of heaven and earth. I knew how to play both saint and sinner. I preached humility by day and hosted masked balls by night. The papal treasury groaned under my appetite, but my vision was grander than austerity. Rome needed to be reborn, so I rebuilt it in the Medici image. The arts exploded under my reign. Raphael painted, Michelangelo sculpted. I didn't just patronize genius, I owned it. People called me indulgent, lavish, even blasphemous. But they misunderstood me. I didn't believe God wanted poverty. I believed he wanted beauty. I ordered the construction of St. Peter's Basilica, not as a church, but as a monument to Medici immortality. Of course, to fund it, I had to sell indulgences. Pieces of paper that promised eternal life in exchange for gold. Some said it was corruption. I called it commerce. And then came the monk. That bitter German nail-pounder, Martin Luther. He accused me of simony, of decadence, of destroying the church. He was half right. I was destroying something. The illusion that the church was beyond politics. I pulled back the velvet curtain and showed the world, popes are kings, and the Vatican is a kingdom. One the Medici ruled. I excommunicated him, but the fire had already spread. The Protestant Reformation scorched Europe like a plague. Still, my name endured, because while Luther printed pamphlets, I printed legacy. My cousin, Giulio, would follow me as Pope Clement VII. His reign. Catastrophic, the sack of Rome, the shattering of Catholic unity. But even then, the Medici name held. We didn't vanish, we pivoted. While Rome burned, Florence thrived, because we had diversified our holdings. Banks, marriages, dukedoms, artists. We weren't just a family anymore, we were a network. The Medici popes turned the Vatican into a family firm, one that baptized babies and assassinated rivals with the same steady hand. Even our enemies had to kneel eventually. France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire. They all came to negotiate with Rome, and in Rome, they came to me. Because I was not just God's representative on earth. I was a Medici, and God may forgive, but we remember, I was the final breath of a dynasty that once ruled the rhythm of the Renaissance, the fate of Florence, and the whispers of the Vatican. My name is Anna Maria Luisa de Medici, and I was born into greatness already dying. The Medici name still rang through palaces and papal halls when I was a girl, but behind the grand facades, our legacy was crumbling. We had become statues in our own city, revered, but frozen. I was the daughter of Cosimo III, Grand Duke of Tuscany, a man obsessed with piety, blind to politics, and terrified of sin. He locked our court in cold ritual, while Europe danced toward enlightenment. Florence faded under his reign. The banks that once financed kings had dried. The workshops of Botticelli and Da Vinci had long gone silent. The Medici court became a mausoleum. Still, I held my head high, because I remembered. The power, the audacity, the beauty. I saw it in every church dome, every fresco, every corridor of the Pitti Palace. I was a Medici, and though I would bear no children, I would not let our name vanish as dust. My brother Gian Gaston, the last male heir, was broken. Physically, mentally, spiritually. He wasted away among courtesans and philosophers. When he died in 1737, so too did the line of Medici men. I stood alone, and yet I was not powerless. Because I held Florence's soul, not in blood, but in brushstroke. I inherited every masterpiece, every relic, every treasure collected over 3 centuries of Medici ambition. The Austrian Habsburgs who took Tuscany wanted to cart it all away, to Vienna, to bury our brilliance beneath theirs, but I refused. In my final act, I penned the family pact, a document that would outlive any crown. I donated every Medici artifact, from Michelangelo's marble to Galileo's telescope, to the city of Florence, with one condition: let nothing be removed. Let it remain for the glory of the city and the benefit of mankind. That was my revenge, my justice. I could not revive our line, but I could preserve our legend. Today, millions walk beneath the dome of the Duomo, or gasp before the David in the Uffizi. They do not always speak our name, but they see our vision. We built a city that became a beacon of beauty, of intellect, of audacity. We started as merchants, rose as bankers, crowned ourselves as dukes, and ruled like emperors behind velvet and ink. They called us ruthless, they were right. They called us manipulators, also true. But they could never call us forgettable, from Cosimo the Elder to Lorenzo the Magnificent, from Leo the Pope to Catherine the Queen, from Machiavelli's patron to Galileo's protector. We did not blend in, we defined the Renaissance. And I, Anna Maria Luisa, the last Medici, made sure the world would never forget that Florence. And indeed, Europe once knelt before a family that turned gold into genius. And now, centuries later, when the sun hits the stones of the Palazzo Medici Riccardi just right, I swear you can still hear it. The echo of footsteps, the shuffle of robed cardinals, the laughter of dukes. The Medici are gone, but our city still speaks our name. If this story made you see history in a new light, if you felt the pulse of betrayal, power, and revenge echoing through centuries, then subscribe for more stories like this. The Medici were more than just rulers, they were architects of destiny, and we've only scratched the surface of what they left behind.